The year was 1817, and England glittered with a deceptive splendor. Beneath chandeliers that dripped with crystal and over marble floors polished to blind the eye, London's high society twirled through another season of wealth and whisper. But even amid the fragrance of rosewater and the gleam of gold-threaded gowns, one truth endured. Reputation was currency, and a woman's honor could be spent in a single night. Lady Eleanor Whitcombe stood at the edge of a ballroom that felt more like a stage than a celebration. Her gown was ivory silk, unadorned save for a modest string of pearls, too plain, some said, for a duke's new bride. Yet it was her poise, not her jewels, that drew the gaze of the room. She did not blush or flutter. She watched. Her eyes were the color of storm glass, clear and steady, and there was something in them that unsettled the glittering assembly, a suggestion that she saw through it all. Across the hall, the Duke of Ravenshire cut a figure carved from duty itself. Tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably restrained, he was every inch the noble England worshipped, brave in war, discreet in scandal, cold in love. His marriage to Eleanor had been less a union of hearts than an arrangement of necessity. Her father's debts had threatened to swallow the Whitcombe estate whole, and the Duke, pressed by his dying father's wish to secure the line, had agreed to take a wife of unblemished name but modest fortune. On their wedding day, the bells had tolled like a benediction and a warning both. They had spoken little since. Their honeymoon, spent in Ravenshire Hall's echoing corridors, was marked by civility without warmth. He admired her intelligence but found her candor unsettling. She found his courtesy a prison, impeccable but airless. Still, Eleanor tried. She wrote him letters filled with gentle reflections on the countryside, the plight of the poor, and her hopes for a shared purpose in their marriage. He never replied. The Duke read them all, but his heart, trained to obey duty over desire, remained locked behind old wounds. It was on a bitter March evening that everything unraveled. A supper was held at Ravenshire to mark the Duke's return from London, and the grand hall glowed with firelight and champagne. Yet the air trembled with something unseen, a tension so fine it could have been mistaken for the hum of the chandeliers. Guests murmured of politics, of France, of peace restored yet fragile. Among them drifted whispers of another, more scandalous sort. Letters, someone said, letters written in a lady's hand to a foreign name. Eleanor noticed the shift before she heard the words. A maid avoided her eyes. Lord Edmund Ashcombe, the Duke's cousin and adviser, leaned too closely to his host, his lips forming the shape of warning. The music faltered. Then the butler entered, pale as parchment, carrying a sealed packet. He bowed low and placed it before the Duke. The hall stilled. Ravenshire broke the seal, and his expression hardened with every word he read. When at last he lifted his gaze to Eleanor, it was not anger she saw, it was disbelief sharpened into something crueler. "These are your letters," he said quietly, though the quiet carried. "Your hand, your seal, your sentiments." The guests watched as the Duke spread before them a series of folded pages, each bearing Eleanor's crest and written in her script. The contents, though no one dared read them aloud, spoke of sympathy for Bonapartist causes, of coded promises to aid a French agent in hiding. To be accused of such correspondence was not merely scandal, it was treason. Eleanor's breath left her. She reached for the papers, but the Duke withdrew them. "My lord," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath, "I have written no such words. Someone has forged." "Enough," he cut in, the sound of his voice like a door slamming. "You forget yourself." A murmur swept the hall. Ladies whispered behind fans. Gentlemen shifted uneasily, unwilling to meet her eyes. Lord Ashcombe offered a sympathetic glance that was too smooth, too swift. "I swear to you," Eleanor began again, but the Duke had already turned away. Before dawn, her trunks were packed. She was told she would reside in the coastal manor at Penarrow, the Whitcombe property on the Cornish cliff. The servants moved quietly, as though handling a corpse. Eleanor did not weep. She stood at the foot of the great staircase, the portrait of her husband's ancestors glowering down, and felt the vastness of her isolation. The Duke came only once before she left. He did not touch her. He did not look at her. He merely handed her a letter of allowance and said, "Until this matter is resolved, you will remain in seclusion. Do not write to me." Her reply was simple, "You have already silenced me, Your Grace." The carriage waited in the courtyard, breath of horses steaming against the grey dawn. Rain had begun to fall, thin and cold. As the wheels turned and the great house receded behind her, Eleanor pressed her palm to the window. She told herself she would not look back, but she did. Once. The high windows of Ravenshire Hall were dark. Days later, in the solitude of Penarrow, she walked the cliffs above the sea. The wind tore at her hair and skirts, but she did not feel its bite. In her hand she held one of the forged letters. The Duke had let it fall to the floor when he left her chamber. She studied the handwriting, the shape of each curve and loop. It was hers, yet not. Every line felt like a theft of her voice. Below her, waves crashed against the rocks with relentless force. She thought of London, of the faces that would now turn away, of the friends who would whisper her name as cautionary tale. Yet beneath the humiliation, something fiercer stirred, a quiet resolve. If the world would exile her, she would learn to live beyond its borders. That night, she built a small fire in the hearth and fed the false letter to the flame. It curled, blackened, and dissolved to ash. The last of it vanished as she whispered, "Let the truth find me one day." Far to the north, in Ravenshire Hall, the Duke sat alone in his study. The letters lay before him, bound with string, the ink still smelling faintly of wax and betrayal. Pride anchored him where reason faltered. He told himself it was justice, that a man of his station could not risk disgrace. But when the wind howled against the windows, he thought he heard her voice, calm, unbroken, receding with the tide. And thus began the silence between them, a silence deeper than distance, heavier than guilt, stretching from the cold marble halls of Ravenshire to the wild Cornish sea. Neither knew then that the silence would last years, nor that one day it would drive a proud man to cross England itself in search of the woman he had cast aside. The sea had become her only confidant. Years had passed since Lady Eleanor Whitcombe's exile to the cliffs of Penarrow, yet the rhythm of the tides had never ceased to echo her heart's own rise and fall. The cottage that once felt like a sentence had grown into a refuge. She kept few possessions, a wooden writing desk, a shelf of old books, and the portrait of her mother, whose calm gaze seemed to remind her that dignity, once broken, could be rebuilt. Every morning she walked to the shore to watch the fishermen haul their nets, offering what aid she could to the widows and orphans left behind by the sea. They called her Lady of the Wind. She did not correct them. The title of Duchess had become an echo, something belonging to another life, another woman. The years had altered her face, softening the fire of youth into something quieter but no less resolute. Her eyes still held the sharp light of conviction, though now it was tempered by loss. In her solitude she had discovered a purpose beyond her disgrace. By candlelight she wrote essays, anonymous pamphlets that spoke of women's education, of charity, of the silent endurance expected of those cast aside. She signed them only with an initial, E. To the world, she no longer existed. Yet her words began to drift beyond Cornwall, carried on merchant wagons and whispered in drawing-rooms. They were admired, even in London. Far from the coast, the Duke of Ravenshire moved through his days like a shadow among his peers. Time had not softened him. It had merely carved his pride into habit. The years following Eleanor's banishment had been prosperous for the estate but barren for the man himself. The country was recovering from the wars, and London was alive again with banquets, reforms, and schemes. Lord Edmund Ashcombe, his cousin, remained his closest adviser, too loyal, too present. It was Edmund who handled the Duke's correspondence, managed his finances, and reminded him that discretion was the armor of nobility. The Duke's name remained unblemished, yet he felt the quiet corrosion of something unspoken. At night, when the servants had gone, He would walk the gallery where Eleanor's portrait once hung. The frame still marked the wall, faintly lighter than the rest, a ghostly absence. He told himself he had done what honor demanded, that treason, even suspected, could not be pardoned by sentiment. But there were nights when the wind rattled the shutters and sounded, impossibly, like her voice carried from afar. He would stand motionless, listening, until the fire died. Then, in the spring of 1823, scandal returned not to Eleanor, but to Ravenshire itself. A clerk was arrested in London for leaking documents to foreign merchants. Among the evidence found in his possession were forged seals and counterfeit correspondences, one bearing the Ravenshire crest. The matter might have passed unnoticed by the Duke, but a magistrate, eager to please, sent word that one of the recovered letters resembled those that had disgraced his wife years before. The Duke dismissed it as coincidence until the papers reached his hand. There, in the faded ink and imitation seal, he recognized the pattern, the same curvature of signature, the same peculiar phrasing. He sent for Edmund at once. "You recall these?" the Duke asked, his tone deceptively calm. Edmund examined the pages with a furrowed brow, then shrugged. "Old ghosts, my lord. Best not stir them." But Ravenshire's gaze lingered on his cousin too long, too sharply. "You knew of them, then?" Only what I was told. The handwriting was hers. You saw it. Did you bring me those letters, Edmund? Or did they arrive by some other hand?" The cousin hesitated, and that pause told the truth before words could. The Duke dismissed him with a quiet that chilled the room. That night, he broke open the locked drawer where he had kept Eleanor's supposed confessions. He laid them side by side with the recovered forgeries, candlelight flickering over the ink. Even a soldier's eye could see it now, the uneven spacing, the subtle shift in hand. Not her writing, not her words. He sank into the chair that had once held him proud and upright, and for the first time in years, he bowed his head. Guilt settled upon him like dust long undisturbed. Every memory, her voice at supper, her calm denial, the way she had refused to weep, came back to him with brutal clarity. He realized he had not exiled a traitor but betrayed a wife. The next morning he ordered a carriage prepared. His staff whispered of illness, but none dared question his purpose. Ravenshire Hall stood silent as he departed, the rain beginning once more as if time itself had resumed from that morning of her exile. The journey to Cornwall was long and penitent. Through villages and valleys, through fields freshly greened by spring, he carried the weight of each mile like confession. He stopped only once, at an inn near Bath, where an old bookseller recognized him and hesitantly presented a small pamphlet. The title read, "Reflections by a Lady of the Wind." The Duke turned its pages slowly, his breath catching at the familiar cadence. It was Eleanor's voice, unmistakable even beneath the disguise of prose. Her words spoke of forgiveness, of pride, and of the quiet courage to exist unseen. When he reached Penarrow, the cliffs greeted him like sentinels. The sea roared below, vast and merciless. The cottage stood at the edge of the land, its windows lit by a single flame. A villager nearby, gray-haired and bent from years of salt and labor, recognized the stranger at once. "You'll find her there, my lord," he said, leaning on his staff, "if she wishes to be found." The Duke dismounted. His boots sank into the damp earth, and for the first time since youth, he felt uncertain, unworthy even to knock upon her door. He hesitated, watching the waves crash against the rocks, and thought of what he would say. Words of apology felt too thin, too late. Inside, Eleanor sat by the fire, unaware of his approach. The years of isolation had woven peace around her, fragile but real. She was writing again, her pen scratching softly against paper. When the wind shifted, she thought she heard the distant tread of hooves, but she did not rise. She had learned that some ghosts return only to test the heart's resolve. Outside, the Duke reached into his coat and drew out one of her old letters, the last she had written him before exile, a letter he had never read until the night before. It was half-finished, ending mid-sentence. "If ever truth divides us, I pray time will return you to it." He closed his eyes. The storm gathered, the rain beginning to fall in earnest. He turned toward the cottage door, the letter trembling in his hand. The narrator's voice would have softened here, had there been one to tell it. Some journeys begin not in pursuit of love, but in atonement for its betrayal. And there are distances longer than miles, the distance between pride and forgiveness. Lightning flashed across the sea, illuminating the solitary figure standing before the house he once condemned his wife to. The door remained closed, yet from within came the faintest sound, a chair moving, footsteps crossing the floor. He took a breath, raised his hand, and knocked. And with that sound, the silence of years began to crack. Rain clung to the air like a veil when the door at last opened. The Duke of Ravenshire stood upon the threshold, rainwater dripping from his cloak, his expression carved from guilt and exhaustion. Eleanor faced him with the calm of one who had long expected disappointment and no longer feared it. Her hair was bound simply, her gown of faded blue wool, her face pale but resolute. For a moment neither spoke. The silence between them, stretched over years of separation, seemed to breathe. Then, without invitation, she stepped aside, allowing him entry as one might grant shelter to a traveler, not a husband. The fire burned low in the hearth. Shadows trembled on the walls, and the air smelled faintly of sea salt and ink. On the table lay an unfinished letter beside a child's primer. The Duke's gaze fell upon it, confusion softening his sternness. "You teach?" he asked, his voice low, uncertain. "I do what I can," she replied. "There are children here who cannot read, widows who cannot write the names of their dead. Words have become my livelihood, though not in the manner once expected of a duchess." Her composure unsettled him more than anger would have. He removed his gloves, placing them carefully upon the table, as though any sudden gesture might shatter the fragile peace. "You have changed," he said finally. She met his eyes. "You left me no choice." The remark cut cleanly, but she delivered it without malice. The Duke looked toward the fire, its glow catching the hollows of his face. "I was deceived," he began, and she turned sharply, the faintest tremor in her stillness. "By whom?" she asked. "By myself as much as by others," he admitted. "The letters were forged. Edmund's treachery was revealed. I see now what blindness pride can bring." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, the flicker of the fire mirrored in her eyes. "So you have come for absolution?" "No," he said, his tone roughened. "I have come for truth, and perhaps to ask if forgiveness is something I might earn." The simplicity of his words unsettled her more than all the formal apologies she had imagined. She had rehearsed anger, cold rejection, the satisfaction of watching him suffer. But now, seeing him stripped of arrogance, she felt an ache deeper than hatred. "Years," she murmured, turning back to the hearth. "Years and not a word. You cast me aside with no trial, no question. Did you ever truly believe me capable of treason?" His answer came slowly, as though each syllable cost him. "I believed only what seemed convenient to a man too proud to doubt himself. I told myself I acted for honor, but it was cowardice, fear of ridicule, fear that love might make me weak." Her gaze softened, but she did not relent. "You speak of love as though it were an indulgence. You never let it live long enough to test your strength." He approached the table, resting one hand upon the worn wood. The storm outside grew louder, the wind rattling the shutters like an impatient witness. "If I could undo what I have done—" "You cannot," she interrupted gently. "There is no undoing. Only what follows." A log collapsed in the hearth, sending up a small shower of sparks. For a while neither spoke. The only sound was the rain and the deep breath of the sea beyond the cliffs. The Duke's eyes wandered the room, its simplicity, its absence of grandeur. There were no jewels, no servants, no trace of the life he had once believed indispensable. Yet it felt more alive than all the halls of Ravenshire. "Do you hate me, Eleanor?" he asked at last. She hesitated. I tried to. Hatred is easier than grief. But grief teaches patience, and patience, she exhaled, the words fading into the crackle of flame. Patience taught me to live without waiting. The admission struck him harder than any reproach. She had built a life that needed nothing of him. The truth of it filled him with both admiration and despair. He stepped closer, the space between them narrowing until he could feel the faint warmth of her presence. I do not deserve your patience, he said quietly. Nor your company, yet I beg it. Not for the man I was, but for the one I am trying to become. Her lips curved, not in a smile but in a gesture of disbelief touched with sorrow. You always did choose noble words when humility might have sufficed. He bowed his head. Then let me be plain. I wronged you. I shamed you. I destroyed the peace I should have guarded. I ask not for love, only that you might one day think of me without contempt. The sincerity in his voice disarmed her. She turned to face him fully now, her eyes shining with unshed tears that did not fall. You speak of contempt, but you mistake me. I have no room for it. My anger burned itself away long ago. What remains is quieter, more dangerous. It is the memory of what might have been had you trusted me. He reached into his coat and drew out a small, time-worn letter, the one she had written the night before her exile. The seal was broken, the ink faded. I read this for the first time only days ago, he said. You wrote, if ever truth divides us, I pray time will return you to it. Time has done its cruel work. I have returned, but I fear too late. Her gaze fell upon the letter. The sight of her own handwriting, youthful, unbroken, moved her more than his words. You were not the only one divided by pride, she said softly. I, too, mistook silence for strength. I might have fought harder, begged louder, but I would not lower myself. Perhaps that is our tragedy. We both defended our dignity at the expense of our hearts. A long silence followed. The wind moaned through the chimney like a lament. Then, almost inaudibly, he said, Since you left, I have lost too. She looked at him then, truly looked, the proud soldier stripped of armor, the man beneath the title. The words were simple, but they carried years of buried ache. For the first time, her expression gentled. Loss is the one language we both speak, she replied. He extended his hand, uncertain, his breath visible in the dim light. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers cool, steady. It was not forgiveness, but it was something, recognition, perhaps, or the faintest permission to begin again. When he released her hand, he stepped back, his composure restored but his heart unguarded. If you would have me prove what I feel, tell me how. Her answer came after a pause long enough to measure truth. Do not ask for redemption, ravens hire. Live it. Let your deeds speak where words cannot. If the man you claim to be exists, let the world see him before I do. He inclined his head. Then I shall try. As he turned to leave, the storm began to ease. The rain softened to a mist, and the sea's fury subsided into rhythm. She followed him to the door, her voice low but clear. Whatever you seek to repair, remember this. Forgiveness is not a gift to be received, but a burden to be earned. He paused upon the threshold, rain-slick and solemn. Then I shall bear it. When the door closed behind him, Eleanor stood listening to the retreating footsteps fading into the wind. The fire had burned low, yet its glow lingered. She looked at the letter still resting on the table, and touched it lightly, as though tracing the ghost of their past. Outside, the waves crashed once more against the cliffs, their sound both relentless and reassuring, as though the world itself were holding its breath for what would come next. Autumn returned to England with the quiet dignity of a long-awaited guest. The leaves fell in shades of amber and wine, softening the harsh lines of the countryside that had endured another year of change. At Penarrow, the sea no longer howled with winter's cruelty, but murmured like an old friend. Within that solitude, Eleanor had found a strange contentment, neither joy nor sorrow, but the calm understanding of a life reclaimed. It had been months since the Duke's visit. He had left with the restraint of a man walking from confession, uncertain whether he had been absolved or condemned. Since then, no letter had come, no message carried by riders. Yet she had heard his name again, not through gossip but through the quiet gratitude of others. It began with a notice pinned to the door of the village church. Ravenshire had opened his lands for the schooling of tenant children, and he had given funds in her name. Later came word that Lord Edmund Ashcombe had fled England after being exposed for embezzlement and deceit. The Duke had not pursued vengeance. Instead, he had restored the estates defrauded under his cousin's hand, paying debts not his own. His actions stirred conversation in drawing-rooms and parlors alike, the whispers of a man remade by remorse. Eleanor read each account with a heart both steady and unsteady, torn between suspicion and reluctant pride. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. The seal was plain, no crest, no title, only his name written with deliberate simplicity. She held it a long while before opening it, half afraid of what silence its contents might break. The letter was brief, the handwriting steady but unadorned. The halls of Ravenshire stand empty without your laughter. Yet I would sooner live in that silence than summon you uninvited again. Should you ever wish to see what has been rebuilt, the doors shall remain open, not by command but by hope. It was signed only Edward. The name struck her more deeply than any title could have. 4 years he had been your grace, a figure of authority, not intimacy. Now he had written as a man, not a duke. She folded the letter carefully, uncertain whether it was an ending or a beginning. That night, sleep eluded her. The sound of the tide outside the window seemed to call her somewhere beyond forgiveness, beyond pride, toward a truth she had long evaded. She still loved him, though love no longer ruled her. Weeks passed before she resolved to go. Her decision was not impulsive. She prepared with quiet precision, as one might for pilgrimage rather than reunion. She left the cottage at dawn, entrusted to a neighbor the small school she had built, and set out for Ravenshire. The journey north unfolded beneath grey skies, through fields she had once passed as a bride, through towns that had forgotten her scandal but remembered her kindness. By the time her carriage crested the final hill, evening light had turned the estate into a vision half real, half memory. Ravenshire stood unchanged and yet transformed, the same towering spires, but windows bright again, gardens restored, the air touched with life. She entered not as a mistress returning to her domain, but as a visitor. The servants greeted her with a reverence mixed with astonishment. Some bowed, others simply wept. A steward led her to the great hall, where a modest gathering was underway. Nobles, scholars, and tenants assembled for a charitable celebration. At the far end stood the Duke, speaking with a young tutor about the newly founded school. His hair was touched with silver now, his expression composed yet softened. When he turned and saw her, conversation ceased like a candle snuffed by wind. He did not approach immediately. Instead, he paused, as though to ensure this moment was real. Then he crossed the floor with deliberate grace, every step an unspoken question. She met him halfway. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice low and steady, "you honor Ravenshire with your presence." She inclined her head, her tone poised yet gentle. "I see you have rebuilt what once was hollow." His lips curved faintly. It was not the walls that required rebuilding. Their words, though formal, carried an intimacy understood only by them. Around them, the guests resumed quiet conversation, pretending not to listen while every ear strained for what might follow. "I have heard of your works," she said. "The schools, the charity, the debts repaid. England seems to have found a new duke." "I only followed the path you once described," he replied. "You showed me what service meant. I merely arrived late to understanding." Silence lingered, filled with what years had left unsaid. Then he gestured toward a small table near the fire. Upon it rested a glass case containing a single pressed violet. She drew nearer, recognition softening her breath. "My wedding flower," she whispered. "It survived, though I scarcely deserved to keep it," he said. I preserved it not as reminder of loss, but of what I failed to cherish. She looked up at him, eyes glimmering. And what is it you cherish now, my lord? He held her gaze without pretense. The courage to be forgiven, though I may never earn it. Eleanor smiled faintly, the expression neither cruel nor yielding. Perhaps forgiveness is not earned. Perhaps it is grown, like this violet, fragile but persistent. The Duke exhaled, a sound half relief, half prayer. Then allow me to nurture it if you will permit. She considered him for a long moment. On one condition, she said. That we begin again, not as debtor and judge but as equals. No titles, no vows made under duress. Two people who choose. He bowed, the gesture more reverent than royal. Then let me be Edward, and you, only Eleanor. For the first time in years, she extended her hand. He took it gently, lifting it not to his lips, but to his heart. The murmurs around them faded into the hush of the fire, and though no declaration was spoken, the silence became its own vow. Later that evening, as guests departed and candles dwindled to their final glow, Eleanor walked through the restored halls alone. Each portrait, each corridor seemed less oppressive than before, touched by the humility of change. When she reached the grand staircase, she paused to look out through the high window. Dawn was breaking, the faintest blue threading the horizon. Behind her, she heard his voice. "You once said truth would divide us," he murmured. "Now I wonder if it has joined us instead." She turned, a gentle smile playing at her lips. "Truth has never divided hearts willing to hear it." He extended his arm, and she took it. Together they descended the stairs, their steps measured, unhurried, as though crossing from one life into another. Outside, the morning bells began to ring across the valley, their sound mingling with the rustle of leaves. The estate stirred awake, alive once more. As they stepped into the pale light, the world around them seemed to hold its breath, a brief, perfect pause before renewal. The narrator, had there been one, might have spoken then. History often remembers the rise and fall of empires, yet forgets that the quietest revolutions begin in forgiveness. On that autumn morning, in the halls of Ravenshire, pride yielded to grace, and two hearts, long exiled, found their home not in title or estate, but in the simple courage to begin again. The doors of Ravenshire closed softly behind them, not as a barrier but as a seal upon a chapter ended. Ahead lay the open fields of a changed England, glimmering beneath the promise of dawn. And somewhere within that light, love, once broken, now reborn, walked beside them, silent yet sure, as the first warmth of morning touched the earth.